We're changing the rear brake pads and rotors on our VTEC today, and I've already taken the wheel off, have everything jacked up and propped up. So I just want to point out what you need to break loose here. First of all, there are these two Phillips head screws here, and you should spray them with some blaster lube or something to loosen up the corrosion that's probably built up in there. And then make sure you have a proper size Phillips head screwdriver. Before I went to try and take these out, I put this in here and slammed the end of this thing with this little mini sledgehammer down here that you can see, and that just made sure that I had a really loosened up the corrosion and gave a really good seating for the Phillips head before I started to turn this, just to make sure that we didn't round off any of these heads. The previous owner looks like it already started to round these off, so I wanted to make sure that I had slammed this in here really good before I tried to turn it. I'll probably replace these. Then you're going to want to break loose these two 14mm caliper bolts, and then you'll just remove both of them all the way. If you haven't done so already, you'll need to release the emergency brake before you can remove the caliper. I've broken the caliper loose in a way, but in order to really move things properly, we're going to have to remove this shield back here. It's not a big deal. It's just a 10mm bolt right there, and there's another one right on the back. You can see the end of it right here. Those two bolts will come out, and then we'll be able to pull this off and be able to swing this whole thing out of the way. Now that that shield has gone out of the way, we can just pull this whole caliper assembly aside. Be careful with the hoses. You don't want any of those lines to come free, or you'll have to bleed your brake system. Okay, I just used some heavy string to tie this caliper up here to my spring so it's up and out of the way and there's no strain on the lines. And then of course the pads just come right out. There's one in the front, one in the back that's totally shot here. To replace the rotor, we have to remove this piece right here, which is preventing the rotor from coming off. It's pretty much ready to come out, but we've got to get this out of the way. So behind here there are two 14mm bolts, and we're just going to get those two bolts loose, one right here, and then we'll be able to remove everything out of the way. Alright, once you remove these two bolts, and by the way, there's a washer under each one, so don't lose that washer. Once you remove those two bolts, this piece right here is just going to come right off, and we'll be able to get the rotor straight off of the hub. Everything's out of the way. Rotor just comes straight off, and ready to put the new one on. Of course, I'll probably take some time first and clean up all these really kind of corroded, rusty looking parts to make them nicer. The new rotor is just going to slide right on here. Just make sure that the small holes that you see right here will line up with these small holes on the hub so that you can resecure this in place. So, as I'm putting these bolts back into place, just want to point out that I did paint those threads with some antiseize lubricant as well, because that's a common place for corrosion to form and making it harder for you in the future to remove the rotor again. Next, we're going to take the caliper bracket that we removed, and you can see I cleaned that up also, and we're going to slide this back into place right here, and then these bolts that are painted with antiseize will then secure it in place from the back side. So we'll put that in and put those bolts together. The proper tightening torque for these bolts right here and the one above is 28 foot-pounds. Time to replace the pads themselves. So of course this old one is basically gone. Here's the new one. You can see it's much thicker as it's supposed to be. So I just want to point out that when you put the new pads in, your original caliper piston is probably much narrower in terms of this gap because of your old thin pad. So you need to spread this back out so you actually have room to get around your pads. And the way that you need to do that easiest is to take the cover off of the master cylinder reservoir under the hood so that there's not pressure on that side, and then you'll just use like a brake caliper spreader, or you can use a large channel lock pliers and just mash this back in to give yourself some space. Make sure that your master cylinder fluid reservoir isn't like all the way to the brim, otherwise you might actually push brake fluid out and it'll kind of make a mess in your engine bay. Now that the piston is completely widened, all we'll do is take this and slide this back into place right here, and we'll replace the two guide pin bolts on the top and the bottom. These just need to be hand tight. Do not over tighten those or you're going to snap off those bolts. If you want to go by the book, these would be tightened down to 16 foot-pounds, which again is basically just around hand tightened. Alright, we have everything back into place. Our caliper with the new pads, we have the caliper bracket all installed. We're going to go ahead and just tighten down these bolts after putting the dust guard back in place. Then we will put the wheel back on, tighten those bolts down to 80 foot-pounds, and we'll be completely done with the rotor and pad replacement on this side. Keep in mind you should do both sides of the car when you change these pads or rotors to keep all your brake performance running in a balanced, even manner.